when you're fighting for that eternal glory, it doesn't matter if they don't hear you right now. My job is to represent the kingdom, not only in my speech, but in my life, right? But a lot of people say, man, I'm willing to die for this. You got to be willing to die for what you love. But I'd say that's the easy way out, because that's a one-time fee. But the hardest thing to do is to live for something, because that requires you to pay that price daily. And that's how we knew Christ was God, not just because he died and rose, but how he lived on the way to the cross, how he blessed others, how he led others. And so if you're truly walking this walk, it says in the scriptures, my burden is easy and my yoke is light, which means that he's going to help carry any challenge that's placed before you. But the hardest part is you got to have the courage to step under that yoke and every day put in the work to be just a little bit better. And man, I ebb and flow. But I will tell you what, my life is infinitely more fulfilling and more rewarding now that Christ is in my life than any other time before. My name is Jeremiah Hodges. Quickly summarize my background, who I am first. Child of God. I love people. I'm a servant. As far as what I've done in the past, I played college football at Hastings, Nebraska for a few years. Graduated with a communications degree from the University of Colorado, Denver. And I've had multiple jobs, including being a driving instructor, public speaker, and interview.
Okay. And what have you struggled with and placed your hope in other than Jesus since you started following him?
One thing that I placed my hope in and I've struggled with coming up throughout my life was the personal ideal of having football as my God. I want to be a professional football player since I could remember as being a child. And from that, I dedicated everything to that, even to the point where I was sacrificing my spiritual dedication to God for what I thought was going to get me eternal happiness. Which really ended up being a place where I found less joy, less love, and actually drove me closer to God, but only after a lot of hardship.
And when did you first start realizing that Jesus was asking you to lay that at his feet?
Sure. So I had endured a great deal of hardship playing college football. I had just returned off of an injury where I pinched a nerve in my neck and couldn't lift my arm above my head, let alone drive. It was a very challenging time in my life, and I was driving back to school from my hometown, and I kept hearing God's voice talk to me. He says, I need you to come back to me. I have something for you to do. But before that happens, you have to sacrifice what you love the most. And I said, well, God, I love you the most. But then when I started to prod my heart, I realized it wasn't God that I loved the most, but the ideal of who I thought I was and the ideal of what I thought I wanted in life. And so that's when I first started noticing it was after a whole lot of hardship, the God just knocking on the window or the glass of my life saying, hey, listen up.
What were some of those things that were maybe challenges or struggles as you began, as he started inviting you into laying that at his feet, and then as you started walking in obedience to laying that at his feet?
Yeah. I am a firm believer that when you're walking with God, no matter what, you're going to produce fruit. Now, fruit doesn't necessarily mean career success. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything that you touch is going to turn to gold, but it does mean that the work that you do is internally satisfying because you know you're working to God's Hall of Fame. You're not working to man's Hall of Fame or what man defines as important. And so what happened was I had an awesome girlfriend who was fantastic, and I tried to walk in a Christian way, but I ended up struggling in that. I wasn't a great boyfriend. I had tried to apply Christian values for a relationship. It didn't work out. I'd end up slipping in, hanging out with the wrong people, and getting into some trouble at school. And then I just kept getting into injury after injury after injury. So everything in my life started not to become a challenge, but a roadblock. And so that's when he started to continually just say, hey man, you're not really walking in the fullness of who I've called you to be.
And so what did you find as you started to search your heart and realize some of those things were true that he was pointing out, and started to lay those things at his feet?
One of the best things that I found out, so I'll walk this story in. I grew up knowing a life that was never apart from Christ. My father's a minister. My mom was in the choir. So I was always in church. I knew of But there's a difference when you grow up and you live under your parents' idea of what faith is, and then you have to find that for yourself. And when he really starts talking to you. And so you know what religion is, right, as a kid growing up in that household. But there's a difference between religion and faith. And my personal definition of faith is where God meets me at the edge of myself. When I've given everything I can for his glory, he's got to take it the rest of the way, because there's so many things in life that we can do that are just simply impossible without the love of Jesus Christ. And what faith also encompasses is his grace and mercy. And as I continued to fight for this dream that I had that was disappearing in front of my eyes, right? Through all these injuries and just personal challenges, I realized that he still loved me. He still loved me despite the fact that I was purposefully running from him. That even in, throughout, we'd have the debates at Hastings, because it's Presbyterian college, and we'd have debates, and I would just start to find myself pulling further and further away from him because, well, that guy made a good point. But what my heart knew to be true and what my circumstances knew to be true started pulling me closer and closer to him. Also, my heart and my mind started to split until I had to realign them in what I knew to be true. And I knew that God was there because I saw the testimony in my mom, who had suffered for 20 years through Crohn's disease. I saw the testimony in my grandmother and many leaders around me. So I knew that he was real. But that began the journey of me finding him for myself and finding what purpose he had for me in that journey.
And so as you started laying down football and started laying down some of these other things and finding your own faith and your own relationship with Jesus rather than religion in and of itself or by itself, what happened when you were able to lay those things specifically at his feet?
I'll tell you what, it was not easy when I laid my idea of what I wanted in life at God's feet. I would like to say that I'm a super macho dude and handled it really well. But I actually cried a lot. I was angry often, and it didn't take much to trigger me to anger. And when I left football, I went into this negative spiral of just a very unproductive life, a very slovenly life. And so that was a great challenge in itself. And so after I'd left football and I was able to sacrifice, sacrifice that false God, what I found was that I had been running from God since before football, where I was putting things in the way. That way I wouldn't have to actually lean into that relationship. That way I wouldn't have to actually acknowledge the existential being that God is, the creator of the universe, and that he has a great purpose for me. Because oftentimes in life we can get our task and our work confused with the purpose of what he has for us. And so as I created space and sacrificed, I saw that God started to step into that gap. I started to get back into prayer. Mentors and leaders started to come into my life because I was more open to who he was. But when I was closed off, it wasn't even possible for him to breach the gates in my heart that I had built up throughout all the challenges growing up.
How has your life changed since laying those things down and walking in obedience to what he's called you into next?
My life has significantly changed since I gave it back to him, right? Because you can be baptized, you can go through all the religious sanctifications and not actually follow God. But once you surrender your heart to him, he changes your life by seeing other lives change. I'll give you an example. When I was going through, I was extremely angry, easily agitated, very aggressive. And I was leaning in. I mean, I was a football player, so that's a part of it. But one thing that wasn't, Christian to me was how I would just snap at people closest to me, my brother, my mom, cousins, just really explosive temperament. But then he started to lead me through different paths I never thought. I started working in this high school, and the program's called AVID, Advanced Review Individual Determination, that helps kids get to college. And I was leading this presentation, and I had started the presentation with Christian values, and I asked them about what they thought about love and true love and what that love does for an individual in life. And I asked the students, because I was trying to make a point equating love to self-discipline. I asked the students, this class of 30, hey, raise your hands if you love yourselves. And I saw that 6 of the students didn't raise their hands. And I was like, hey, I don't know if you guys heard me, but I want you to raise your hand if you love yourself. And 6 of the students didn't raise their hand. And one courageous young girl, I'll never forget her, she said, well, Instructor Jay, what if we don't love ourselves? And that was when I knew that there was a deeper purpose for my life that revolved around serving others. After the class, she ended up talking to me, telling me that I had actually helped her solve some of the challenges that she was dealing with regarding suicide. And I know it wasn't me, because the presentation was based off of Christian principles of love. And that's when I realized that God was taking my life and using it to bless others. And so that was the greatest change that I noticed when I started actually following God for myself, instead of leaning on what my own ideations or task was in my life.
Can you describe now what it's like to walk in obedience to what he's called you into, this relationship with him, walk in your own faith, and just walk in obedience to those things, and a spirit of power and of love and of self-control?
That's funny that you mentioned that question. That's my favorite Bible verse, 2 Timothy 1:7. I would like to say that I'm fantastic at it. I would like to say that it's been easy, but it's been a struggle. It's been hard. There are so many temptations out there. There's so many times in my life where I want to live for myself, where I want to do a thing. There's a quote by one of my favorite military leaders in history, John Boyd. He says, you can either be somebody or do something. Being somebody is how you're perceived in the world, and doing things for other people's accolade and appraisal and praise. But doing something oftentimes gets you ridiculed. And so, whether it's trying to start a Christian ministry in a place that's more austere and doesn't really welcome that, or whether it's just trying to have a simple biblical conversation, it's been tough. And then another thing is, it's extremely difficult when you want to share your faith with other people. And you're like, man, I know God can change your life because he's changed mine, and they're not really receptive to it. But when you are fighting to be in God's Hall of Fame, when you're fighting for that eternal glory, it doesn't matter if they don't hear you right now. My job is to represent the kingdom, not only in my speech, but in my life, right? I have a philosophy, and I'll be quick here. But a lot of people say, man, I'm willing to die for this. You got to be willing to die for what you love. But I'd say that's the easy way out, because that's a one-time fee. But the hardest thing to do is to live for something, because that requires you to pay that price daily. And that's how we knew Christ was God, not just because he died and rose, but how he lived on the way to the cross, how he blessed others, how he led others. And so if you're truly walking this walk, it says in the scriptures, my burden is easy and my yoke is light, which means that he's going to help carry any challenge that's placed before you. But the hardest part is, you got to have the courage to step under that yoke and every day put in the work to be just a little bit better. And man, I ebb and flow. But I will tell you what, my life is infinitely more fulfilling and more rewarding now that Christ is in my life than any other time before.
Man, that's beautiful, Jeremiah. Thank you for sharing your story. I appreciate it. Last question, we wrap up. Who is Jesus to you?
Jesus is the head of my life. He's what I live for. He is what I strive to be like, what I know I'll never reach. And most of all, he is a loving father. He's an individual who, well, he's a part of the Trinity, of course, but to me, he's personal. He's an individual and a being that forgives me no matter what I do, that leads me down a path of righteousness, that chastises me and hones me into a tool to be used for his purpose. And without Christ, he's my North Star, man. Whenever I get off track, I look up and I say, where is Christ in this? And I always know where to go. So,
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.